The summer of 1953 came down on the hill country of central Missouri like a hammer on an anvil. By the middle of July, the creek beds had gone to gravel and the pasture grass had turned the color of old straw. The cattle stood in the shade of the fence lines and didn't move much, and the hogs had pushed every bit of wet mud out of the wallow and were lying flat against the bare dirt, trying to find something cool underneath. Vernon Aldrich had been watching the sky every morning since the middle of June, walking out onto the porch before the sun was fully up, looking southwest the way his father had taught him, reading the clouds for any sign of relief that never seemed to come. Vernon was 51 years old that summer, and he had been working the same 160 acres his grandfather had broken from timber in 1891. He knew every low spot in every field, every place where the frost came late and the place where it came first, every corner where the wind piled snow in February, and every hollow where the spring water ran sweet even in August. He knew this land the way a man knows the back of his own hand, not by thinking about it, but by years of just living inside it, until the knowing became part of him without any effort at all. But the summer of 1953 was testing everything Vernon Aldrich knew. The well that served his livestock lot had been there since his grandfather's time. It sat in the northwest corner of the main pasture, enclosed by a low wooden surround his father had built sometime in the early 1920s, and around it, in a wide circle that extended maybe 30 feet out in every direction, stood 8 willow trees of considerable size. The oldest of them had trunks nearly 2 feet across at the base. They were not ornamental. No one had planted them for beauty. They were there because Vernon's grandfather, a man named Caspar Aldrich, who had come out of southern Indiana with a wagon, a wife, a set of hand tools, and a working knowledge of land that had been passed down to him through his own father, had put them there deliberately, at measured intervals within the first few years of establishing the farm. And he had done it for reasons that had everything to do with water, with the survival of livestock through summer, and with a practical understanding of soil and hydrology that the old farmers carried in their heads long before any university extension agent ever put it in a pamphlet. This is the story of why those trees were there, what they did, and why the knowledge behind them was some of the most important and least celebrated farm wisdom of the American rural tradition. To understand what Caspar Aldrich understood, you have to go back to the basic problem of a livestock well on a working farm in the decades before rural electrification and mechanical pumping were widespread. In the 1930s and 40s and into the 50s across much of the rural Midwest and South, a livestock well was almost always a dug well, not a drilled well in the modern sense, but a hand-dug or horse-powered auger, well that went down through the topsoil and the clay subsoil until it hit the water table, which on most hill country farms in Missouri, Iowa, Kentucky, Tennessee, and the surrounding states sat somewhere between 20 and 60 feet down, depending on the geology of the particular parcel. These wells were typically lined with stone, or later, with poured concrete rings, and they relied entirely on the surrounding soil, allowing water to seep through and refill the well from what geologists call the perched water table, or the shallow aquifer. The problem with a livestock well in a dry summer was not simply that the water table dropped, although it did. The deeper problem was what happened to the soil around the well when cattle, hogs, and horses stood on it day after day, season after season. Livestock congregate near water. That is just their nature. In a hot July, a herd of 20 or 30 beef cattle might stand near the well for hours at a time, pawing the ground, milling around, pressing against each other, their hooves working the soil beneath them into a compacted, sealed layer of clay and dirt and manure that, over years, became nearly impermeable to water movement. The old farmers called this puddling of the soil, a term that appears in agricultural literature going back to the mid-1800s, and it was one of the most serious and underappreciated threats to a farm's water supply during a dry year. When the soil around a well became puddled and compacted, the natural infiltration of rainfall into the ground was dramatically reduced. Water that should have been soaking down through the soil profile and recharging the aquifer beneath the well was instead running off the surface or pooling briefly and then evaporating. The well, cut off from its natural recharge pathway, would drop faster in a dry summer and recover more slowly after a rain. This is what Caspar Aldrich had been taught to prevent, and the willow trees were the solution. The mechanics of it were elegant in the way that the best old farm solutions always were, not complicated, not requiring any manufactured inputs, but working entirely with the natural tendencies of the living landscape, rather than against them. Willows, across their many species, and the ones most commonly planted around Midwest farm wells, were typically the black willow, the sandbar willow, or occasionally the weeping willow, where the aesthetic happened to align with the practical, are among the most aggressively water-seeking trees in temperate North America. Their root systems are famously, almost troublesomely, extensive. A mature willow planted near a source of consistent moisture will send lateral roots outward and downward in a dense fibrous network that can extend 2 and 3 times the spread of the canopy above ground. These roots do not compress the soil. They do the opposite. As they grow and as they die and are replaced by new roots over years and decades, they create a network of channels and pores through the soil, what soil scientists call macropores, that dramatically improve the ability of the soil to absorb and transmit water downward. In other words, while the cattle were compacting the soil on the surface around the well and reducing its permeability, the willow roots were working in the opposite direction just a few feet away, opening up the subsoil and maintaining pathways for water to move down toward the aquifer. Planting the willows in a ring around the well, close enough that their roots would extend under the congregation area of the livestock, far enough that the cattle themselves were not directly damaging the root zone in the critical early years, created a system where the compaction caused by the animals was partially offset by the biological work of the trees. The willows also held the soil around the well against erosion during heavy rains, when the bare, hoof-churned ground near a livestock water source was extremely vulnerable to having its topsoil washed away in sheets. There was a second function, and this one was equally important on a hot Missouri summer afternoon: the shade. A shallow dug well in direct summer sun loses water to evaporation from the surface of the water itself, and more critically, it loses water from the soil immediately around the casing, because that soil, heated by direct sunlight to temperatures that can exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface, dries out rapidly and loses its hydraulic connection to the water below. The water doesn't disappear, but its ability to move through the dry, cracked, heat-baked soil around the well is severely compromised until the soil cools and re-wets. Willow trees planted in a ring provide dense canopy shade that keeps the soil immediately around the well measurably cooler during the hottest part of the day. Temperature studies done later in the 20th century by university extension programs consistently found that shaded soil could be 15 to 25 degrees cooler on the surface than adjacent unshaded soil during peak summer heat, and that this temperature difference had significant effects on evaporation rates and soil moisture retention. The cattle benefited directly from the shade as well. Animals that can stand in shade during peak afternoon heat eat less and drink less. Their thermoregulatory burden is reduced, which means they metabolize less water, which means the demand on the well is lower precisely during the hours when the well is under the most natural stress from heat and low recharge. This was not an accident of design. The old farmers knew that a watering point with shade was a fundamentally more efficient system than a watering point in open sun, and the willow ring around the well solved both problems with one planting. Vernon Aldrich walked his property line in the last week of July 1953 and counted his blessings with the careful, unsentimental eye of a man who had lived through the droughts of the 1930s and knew what real water trouble looked like. His neighbor to the east, a younger man named Dale Pritchett, who had bought the Harmon place in 1949 after the old man Harmon died, had cut down the 2 big cottonwoods that used to stand near his stock pond because they were dropping limbs, and he didn't want the mess. He had also never bothered to plant anything around his dug well, which sat in a bare, packed clay yard that the cattle had beaten down to something resembling a brick floor over the 5 years he'd owned the place. Dale's well was already down to 18 inches of water by the last week of July. He had borrowed Vernon's extra stock tank and was hauling water from the creek, which was itself running low, every other day to keep his cattle drinking. Vernon's well, ringed by the old willows his grandfather had planted 60 years before, still had 4 feet of water in it when he measured it with the weighted string he kept on a nail in the well house. Not plenty, he was careful with it, letting the cattle water in the morning and again in the late afternoon, rather than having continuous access during the heat of the day, but enough. Enough to get through if the rains came before the middle of August. They came on the 14th, 2 inches in a slow, soaking overnight rain that the old farmers called a $1 million rain because it was soft enough to go into the ground instead of running off. Vernon heard it on the tin roof of the well house at about 2 in the morning and lay there in the dark listening to it for a while before he went back to sleep. And the feeling he had was one that is very difficult to describe to someone who has not lived through a farm drought. A loosening of something that has been pulled tight for weeks, a physical relaxation that had nothing to do with the comfort of the bed and everything to do with the sound of water on a roof after a long dry spell. By the 18th, his well was back to its normal summer level. The practice of planting willows around a farm well, or indeed any water-dependent feature like a spring box, a seep, or a small pond, was widespread across the farming regions of America from at least the mid-1800s through the middle of the 20th century. It appears in farm journals, in agricultural society reports, in the personal letters of working farmers, and in the accumulated oral tradition that passed from father to son and from neighbor to neighbor across generations. It was not universal. There were plenty of farms, especially those established by recent immigrants from European traditions, where the specific hydrogeological conditions were different, where the practice was not followed. But among the families who had been farming American ground for 2 or 3 generations, particularly in the river-influenced hill country of the Midwest and Upper South, the willow ring around the water source was a recognizable feature of a well-run operation. The knowledge behind it was rarely articulated in scientific terms. The farmers who practiced it generally explained it in observational language. They had seen that wells surrounded by trees held up better in dry years, that the ground around tree-shaded wells stayed softer and darker and held moisture longer, that cattle watered from covered wells seemed to fare better in summer than cattle watering from open tanks or exposed wells. The understanding was empirical, built from observation over time, and it was passed down not through books but through direct demonstration. A father would take his son to the well in July and show him how the soil around the willow roots was different from the soil 10 feet away, darker, softer, cooler to the touch, and the son would remember. That was the curriculum. That was the extension service of the American farm tradition for the first 200 years of this country's agricultural history. What these farmers were practicing, without the vocabulary to name it, was a form of what soil scientists and hydrologists would later call riparian buffering, the use of deep-rooted woody vegetation to maintain soil structure, filter surface runoff, moderate temperature extremes, and protect shallow groundwater sources from the compaction and contamination that comes with heavy animal use. The willow ring around the livestock well was a pre-scientific implementation of a principle that would not be formally described and studied until the second half of the 20th century. There is a particular conversation that Vernon Aldrich had with his youngest son, Raymond, in the fall of 1953, after the rains had come and the well had recovered and the summer's tension had finally broken. Raymond was 19 that year, and he had grown up on the farm but was already talking about going to the agricultural college at Columbia the following September. He was smart and ambitious, and not entirely sure he was going to stay with farming, and Vernon was aware of this without pushing against it, because he understood that a life on the land had to be chosen, not inherited. They were walking the fence line along the north pasture on a cool October afternoon, checking the wire after the summer and tightening staples where the posts had shifted, when Raymond stopped at the corner near the well and looked up at the willows which had already gone to yellow in the early fall color. "Those trees are the ugliest things on this place in the winter," Raymond said. "Just sticks. Half of them hang over the well and drop stuff in the water." Vernon kept walking the fence line, pulling on each wire to test the tension. "Your great-grandfather planted every one of them," he said, "before your grandfather was old enough to hold a hammer." "I know that, but why? They're not timber, they're not fruit, they don't do anything." Vernon stopped at the next post and took the fence pliers off his belt. He worked at a loose staple for a moment before he answered. "Dale Pritchett was hauling water out of a creek with a tank wagon for 6 weeks this summer," he said. "We weren't. You figure out why, you'll know what those trees do." Raymond thought about it. He was quiet for a while as they moved down the fence line. Then, The shade, to keep the well cool? That's part of it. The roots, something about the roots keeping the ground from packing up around the water? Now you're getting somewhere. Vernon glanced at his son. Your great-grandfather didn't know the words for it, neither do I, really. But he saw something that worked and he remembered it. And he did it. That's the whole history of farming right there. Raymond Aldrich did go to the Agricultural College at Columbia. He graduated in 1958 with a degree in agronomy, and when he came back to help his father, not because he had to, but because he found that he genuinely wanted to, he could explain in precise scientific language exactly what the willow trees were doing and why they worked. He could tell you about macropore formation and hydraulic conductivity, and the thermal properties of shaded versus unshaded soil. He could cite studies. His father listened to all of it with polite interest and then went back to work. Neither of them thought that the explanation added anything to the fact of the trees themselves, which stood in their ring around the well and did their work regardless of what anyone called it. The willow tree's relationship with water is one of the most well-documented botanical facts in the natural history of North America. The indigenous peoples of the continent had extensive knowledge of willows long before European settlement. They used the bark medicinally. The flexible young shoots for basket weaving, fish traps and the ribs of small dwellings. And they were well aware of the willow's affinity for wet ground, using its presence as a reliable indicator of subsurface water when traveling through unfamiliar country. This last application, using willows as a water-finding indicator species, was one that European settlers adopted very quickly after arriving in America, and it was foundational to the livestock well tradition. When a farmer was choosing a site for a new well, one of the most reliable early indicators that the water table was accessible at a reasonable depth was the presence of willows or other water indicator species like cottonwood, elderberry, and certain sedges growing naturally in the vicinity. The old farmers said, simply and correctly, that where willows grew on their own, there was water underground within reach. This knowledge was so widely held by the mid-19th century that it appears in homesteader manuals, in the agricultural press of the time, and in the accounts of settlers moving into the prairie states during the Great Western Expansion following the Civil War. When families took up quarter sections under the Homestead Act of 1862 and later legislation, one of the first tasks on a new claim was finding a well site, and the advice to look for willows and cottonwoods and then to plant willows deliberately after the well was dug was standard guidance in the agricultural literature of the period. The United States Department of Agriculture, in various bulletins published in the first decades of the 20th century on the subject of farm water supplies, referenced the practice of sheltering wells with trees, and later bulletins specifically from the 1930s addressed the role of vegetation in maintaining shallow well integrity during drought conditions. The 1930s are, of course, the decade that gave this entire body of knowledge its sharpest urgency. The Dust Bowl years, particularly the catastrophic drought years of 1934 and 1936, which affected the Great Plains and significant portions of the Midwest with an intensity that had not been seen in the recorded meteorological history of the region, reduced farm water supplies across an enormous geographic area to the point of crisis. Families who had lived on a given piece of ground for 2 and 3 generations, who had sunk wells that had never gone dry, watched those wells fail in the summer heat of the middle 30s. The connection between good vegetative management around water sources and the ability of those sources to survive extreme drought became, for that generation of farmers, an empirical fact learned through direct, sometimes devastating experience. The agricultural extension services that expanded dramatically through the 1930s, partly through the funding and organizational support of the New Deal programs, spent considerable effort documenting and disseminating the practical wisdom that working farmers had already developed through experience. County agents in Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, Kentucky, and Tennessee visited farms, took notes on what was working, and spread that knowledge to neighboring operations. The willow and tree sheltering of well sites was one of the practices that got documented and recommended during this period, not as a new idea, but as a formalization of what the best managed farms in each community had already been doing for decades. The cultural dimension of this knowledge is worth dwelling on because it speaks to something deeper about how American farming communities in the mid-20th century understood their relationship with the land. The knowledge of why to plant willows around a well was not the property of any individual. It was communal knowledge, passed down through families and shared across communities in the dense social network of the rural church, the Grange Hall, the threshing ring, and the fence line conversation. A farmer who had a well that held up through a dry summer would show his neighbors. A farmer whose well failed would be shown what he had done wrong and what he needed to do differently. The exchange of practical knowledge was the currency of rural community life, and it moved freely because everyone understood that their survival was interconnected. When Vernon Aldrich helped Dale Pritchett haul water in the summer of 1953, he didn't charge him for the use of the tank wagon, and the following spring, when the ground had thawed and the planting season was still a few weeks away, Vernon spent an afternoon with Dale at the Pritchett well, showing him where to set the willow starts he had dug from along his own creek bank, explaining the spacing and the reason for it, describing what to expect in the first few years while the root systems were establishing themselves. Dale listened carefully. He was a younger man, and he had not grown up with this knowledge, but he was not too proud to learn from a neighbor who had it. It takes a willow tree planted from a rooted start approximately 3 to 5 years to develop the kind of extensive root system that begins to meaningfully improve soil permeability around a well site. The trees Caspar Aldrich had planted around the Vernon family well in the early 1890s had been working the soil for 60 years by the summer of 1953. The root network extended 10, 15, 20 feet out from the base of each tree in every direction, and in the areas where the root zones of adjacent trees overlapped. The soil structure was exceptional, loose and dark and crumbly even in dry weather, channeled with the biological passages left by decades of root growth and decay, alive with earthworms and soil organisms that further maintained its structure and permeability. This was the inheritance Caspar had left his son, and his son had left Vernon. Not land free of work, not land that managed itself, but land that had been set up correctly so that the natural systems of the landscape were working in the farmer's favor rather than against him. The willow tree also contributed to well health in a way that the early farmers understood less precisely, but still recognized, through the filtration of surface runoff. A livestock well site is a heavily used, heavily contaminated piece of ground. Cattle manure, urine, the general biological waste of animals congregating in one spot over years and decades, all of this accumulates on the surface around a well and represents a significant contamination risk to the water supply below. A ring of trees with their associated ground cover of grass and fallen leaves and root mats acts as a natural filter for surface water moving toward the well casing. The organic matter and the biological activity in the soil around the tree roots captures and processes contaminants before they can percolate down to the water table. Modern water quality research has extensively documented this filtration function of woody riparian vegetation, but again, the farmers who planted willow rings around their wells were achieving the benefit whether or not they could explain the mechanism. What they knew was that tree-shaded, vegetated well sites generally produced better tasting water and made their livestock visibly healthier than bare, compacted, open well sites. The why of it was less important to them than the what of it. This practical epistemology, the prioritization of demonstrated outcome over theoretical explanation, is one of the defining characteristics of the American farm tradition in its classic period, and it is worth understanding and honoring rather than dismissing. The farmers of the 1930s through the 1960s were not anti-intellectual. Many of them were voracious readers of agricultural journals, deeply engaged with the Extension Service literature, and genuinely interested in the science behind what they were doing when that science was available to them. But they operated in a world where the margin for error was narrow, and the consequence of a failed practice was real and immediate. And so they held experimental knowledge to a standard of demonstrated reliability that academic knowledge alone could not always meet. The willow ring around the well had been demonstrated to work across multiple generations, across multiple drought years, across the full range of conditions that a working farm in the American Midwest would encounter. That was enough. The explanation would come later, as it always does. Raymond Aldrich eventually did become a farmer. He farmed the same 160 acres his father and grandfather and great-grandfather had worked, and he added a second parcel when the Harmon place next door came back on the market, after Dale Pritchett retired and moved to town in 1972. By that point, the agricultural world was changing rapidly. Rural electrification was complete across virtually all of Missouri. Submersible electric pumps had replaced the pitcher pumps and hand-cranked mechanisms that had served farm wells for a century. Drilled wells going 200 and 300 feet deep into the deep limestone aquifer were increasingly replacing the old shallow dug wells as the standard for new construction. And yet, Raymond Aldrich never cut down the old willow trees around the well in the northwest corner of the main pasture. His son, who took over the operation in the 1980s, never cut them down either. By that point they were close to 100 years old, gnarled and massive and unmistakably ancient, and the well they surrounded had been decommissioned and replaced by a drilled well with an electric pump sometime in the early 1960s. The trees no longer served their original function in the narrow sense. The well they were protecting was no longer in use. But they served other functions. They were shade for the cattle in the summer. They were windbreak in the winter, softening the cold northwest wind that came down across the open pasture in January and February. Their roots held the soil in a low corner of the pasture that was prone to erosion during spring runoff. Warblers and orioles nested in them every summer, and the insect populations those birds controlled contributed to the health of the pasture. The organic matter falling from them every autumn enriched the soil in a wide circle around their bases. They were still doing work, different work than Caspar Aldrich had planted them to do, but work nonetheless. And the family had the good sense and the agricultural instinct to understand that a thing doing work should not be removed just because you no longer understood exactly what the work was. There is a lesson in that, and it is one of the oldest lessons in American farming. The land is always doing something, and the farmer's job is less often to impose a design on it than to understand the design already present and work with it intelligently. The willow ring around the livestock well was not Caspar Aldrich's invention. It was his observation of what worked, encoded into the permanent landscape of his farm, so that every generation that came after him would benefit from what he had seen. That is what good farming looked like in its best expression. Not just the management of crops and animals in the current season, but the deliberate building of a farm system that would be more capable, more resilient, and more productive 20 and 50 and 100 years in the future than it was the day the work was done. The summer of 1953 finally broke in the middle of August, and the fall that followed was one of the best that Vernon Aldrich could remember, mild and long, with good rain spread across September and October, and the pastures coming back with the kind of dense, even growth that meant the root systems had survived the drought without serious damage. He sold his full calves at a price that covered the summer's costs and left a margin, which was what a good year looked like on a hill country farm in 1953. Not wealth, a margin. He walked out to the well one evening in late October, in the slanting gold light that comes in the fall when the angle of the sun is low, and everything it touches seems to glow from inside itself. The willows had gone fully yellow, and some of them were already dropping leaves, the yellow leaves drifting down through the still air and settling on the water of the well, where it showed dark and cool between the stone casing walls. He stood there for a while without thinking about much, in the way that farmers stand in their fields in the evening, not resting exactly, but not working either, just being present in the place and taking account of it. His grandfather had stood in this same spot, he thought, had looked at these same trees, or the trees that were now these trees, and felt whatever a man in 1890-something felt, standing at his well in the fall when the water was good and the cattle were fat, and the year was coming to a decent close. The specific feelings were probably not so different. Water, shade, a good well that held up through a dry summer. The work of a long-dead man still working in the soil around you. He put the wooden cover back over the well casing and walked back toward the house in the fading light. And the willows stood behind him in the October evening, yellow and ancient, doing what they had always done. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. Truly. It means a lot that you spent this time here with us, exploring the deep roots of American farm wisdom. If this story connected with you, If it reminded you of land you knew or people who worked it, please give this video a like. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you never miss the next piece of history we bring back to life. And share this with someone who would appreciate it, a neighbor, a family member, someone who still carries a connection to the land. These stories deserve to be heard. This video is inspired by real events and real practices from American agricultural history. It does not intend to represent or offend any individual, family, or community. Vernon Aldrich is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced exactly these situations: the summer droughts, the failing wells, the knowledge passed down through generations during this era. He stands for all of them,